We've got some sound coming on. Thank you very much. And this conference this year builds very much on the foundation that was laid at the conference last year. And those who were here last year may remember that there was a bit of a discussion, I think spearheaded by Ron Numbers, about do we really want to keep talking about the dialogue between science and religion? And there are various reasons why you might not want to, partly because of questions of historical accuracy. That is to say, first of all, the categories of science and religion are a relatively sort of recent concept and certainly didn't exist in those forms until comparatively recently. So you may be reading back inappropriate categories to times when they didn't apply. Also, of course, because this so-called conflict narrative has become so grossly distorted that it's hard to recognize any correspondence to what actually happened. But there are other reasons, too, why we might want to move forward. And one of them is because we want to be forward-looking. We want to see where are we going, and what direction do we want to encourage things to go in. And speaking for myself, the direction I want things to go in is to see how we can promote human flourishing by drawing on the very best of scientific insight combined with the very best of spiritual wisdom. And I hope that as we work together today and tomorrow, we'll begin to see how that might happen. And this session is a very, very good starting place because we have a speaker who is hugely distinguished in studies of patristics and the Orthodox theological tradition. And another speaker who is hugely distinguished in scientific work now, who is wanting to engage with the Orthodox tradition and see how science can contribute to that and take things forward. So I love this combination of the humanities and the sciences in a single session. And we're going to start with, and I'm trying to get the pronunciation right, Presbyter Dr. Doro Kostake. Is that right, Doro? Is that a good way to pronounce it? There are many wrong ways to pronounce it, but only one way to pronounce it. And he comes originally from Romania, but for many years he's been working in Sydney, in Australia. So he brings a rich experience of studying and teaching in two very different kinds of cultures. And rather than read through all his accolades, and indeed the next speaker's accolades, I thought it'd be rather fun to tell you something that I share with each of them that not many people know about. And what I share with Doro that not many people know about is that each of us has co-authored a book with a Wagner. and Doro has written a book with, it's Dr. Kevin Wagner that you've written a book with, and I've written a book with Roger Wagner, and so we share that in common. But without any further ado, let me hand over to you, and you're going to tell us all about one description, multiple interpretations, suggesting a way out of the current impasse. So if you want to be there, yeah, you've got that one on the way.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Briggs, for this beautiful introduction. My paper is about Orthodox fundamentalism and how it is fueled by the current ideologization of science. Also, it's about a possible way out of the warfare paradigm, the opposition in science and theology. Now, contemporary science offers the only rigorous description of the world, part and whole. Until a new science replaces it, this prescription
should remain the reference point for any conversation. To uphold outmoded descriptions of the world as it happens in certain Orthodox quarters is problematic. For some indeed, since the church fathers of old have referred to ancient science, modern Orthodox cannot change an iota in terms of how they represent reality today. But the computation of the world's age to roughly 8,000 years is neither an article of faith nor an acceptable description of reality. Neither are geocentric cosmography and the flat earth geography, nor is the notion of a celestial ceiling whose light bulbs are the stars. Nor is the ancient notion of inert matter, which requires extraneous interventions from an Aristotelian prime mover or a theatrical deus ex machina. Nor is the Julian calendar. Yet such anachronisms still linger in certain Orthodox quarters against the backdrop of an, overall opposition to modern science. This situation impacts the Church itself and the Church's rapport with contemporary culture. First, this situation causes dissension within Orthodoxy. In contrast with the anachronism of certain quarters, most Orthodox neither follow the old calendar nor believe in a recently made cosmic ceiling which revolves around the flat earth, mechanistically pushed by an Aristotelian prime mover situated somewhere over the rainbow. Contemporary Orthodox speak, therefore, mutually incomprehensible languages corresponding to opposite representations of reality. Committed to outmoded sciences under the pretense of cherishing tradition. Some speak gibberish, whereas others, other Orthodox that is, translate the traditional worldview into the spoken language of contemporary scientific culture. Is there anything traditional about anachronism? Orthodoxy these days boasts of being anachronistic, traditionalist, and so on and so forth. Is there anything traditional about anachronism? Rhetorics notwithstanding, no church father of old has replaced the then available Hellenistic science by the mythical worldview of the ancients. And since the church fathers of old have consistently referred to the science of their time to translate into the new cultural idiom the wisdom of the ancient faith, is the traditional way ahead. As the encyclical of the Holy and Great Council of 2016 states, I quote, "The identification of the Church with conservatism, incompatible with the advancement of civilization, is arbitrary and improper," end of quote. Until Orthodox adopt the standard description of the world and replace gibberish by the vernacular, Orthodoxy will remain unable to gain either inner unity or external credibility. This point leads me to the second impact of anachronism. Outmoded notions such as those mentioned above discredit the Orthodox representation of reality as mythical and inconsequential for today's society and culture. It should not come as a surprise, therefore, that whereas to communicate their findings, contemporary scientists seek alternative terms and imagery to their own specialized jargon. So that happens, but no one considers the Orthodox tradition a worthwhile resource in this regard. Because of the anachronistic gibberish of some quarters, they, the scientists, dismiss the wisdom of our tradition. Given the difficulties it generates, anachronism should be abandoned and genuine tradition restored. There is no other way to bridge the various factions within Orthodoxy and connect Orthodoxy with the scientific culture of today. Returning to the previous sentence about scientists seeking different metaphors, paradigms in order to communicate the outcomes of their research. I want to see this happening in our day and age, to have a scientist that does, from an Orthodox viewpoint, what Kepler did with the Tower of Physics, for instance. Nothing like this happens, and I believe that's because of mainly two things. On the one hand, we Orthodox treasure a lot our secrecy, although the internet is full of us. On the other hand, we represent ourselves in the media in a very wrong way. As defenders of ancient lore and all that, and not interested in whatever happens today. Nevertheless, is there anything noteworthy about the criticisms leveled by the anachronistic milieus at contemporary science? I believe there is. What determines the anachronistic opposition to the scientific description of reality is that the latter is ideologically fraught, lending substance to agnostic, atheistic, naturalistic, and materialistic agendas. Anachronism represents an extreme reaction to another form of extremism, promoted both by members of the scientific community and the ideological zealots who twist the scientific inquiry into serving their own agendas, particularly their disdain for, broadly speaking, religion. As long as the scientists allow their research to be ideologically hijacked and do not denounce the unscientific nature of such ideologies, there will be a reason for the anachronistic circles within Orthodoxy to resist science. In what follows, I attempt to sketch a way out of this situation. I propose that the distinction between description and interpretation must be observed, and that the scientific description of reality allows for multiple interpretations. Well, speaking of, or using Professor Andronakis' excellent presentation earlier, you know, is that one genome reinterpreted, reinvented in the individual genomes, something like that, you know, if I may extend that metaphor here. The agnostic, atheistic, naturalistic, and materialistic ideologies which confiscate contemporary science represent biased interpretations of science, not science itself. Science, since it pursues discovery, science should maintain ideological neutrality. And there's so many examples, you know, the famous Richard Dawkins, you know, because the genes are there, there's no God, you know, the famous equation. Very recently, just these days, you know, Professor Basarab Nicolescu's theorization in the 70s about the odoron, the odd subparticle came to be acknowledged scientifically, you know, via experiments, and I wonder if Basarab will say something like this: because the odoron exists, there's no God. Or because the odoron exists, there's a God. I think that's equally silly. It would be equally silly, anyway, that's my opinion. However, its results, that is the scientific results, can be interpreted from multiple viewpoints, theistic and atheistic alike, all equally unscientific and relevant to particular layers of society. Theological interpretations of science relevant to faith-oriented quarters are as legitimate as the atheistic interpretations relevant to other quarters. Should science maintain ideological neutrality, allowing it instead for a variety of interpretations, including theological? The current description of reality could become readily acceptable to all Orthodox factions. And I insist on calling them factions because this is how they behave these days, as factions. In what follows, I seek the wisdom of St. Basil the Great to then draw lessons for today, mediated by an overview of modern Orthodox approaches to science. I aim to show that the solution I propose is traditionally rooted, being therefore acceptable to all Orthodox, and that in this light, a more beneficial conversation between theologians and scientists can be engaged. So turning to St. Basil the Great, I think I won't be reading everything that I have here. A few highlights. St. Basil died in 379, and he was a polymath. He was trained in both the curricular sciences of the time. He was schooled in Athens, the center of intellectual learning in the ancient world, but also trained in the ecclesiastical wisdom. And as such, St. Basil had a privileged kind way of looking at things from both perspectives, say curricular or scientific, disciplinary if you like, and also the wisdom of the church. And from this viewpoint, he has displayed some kind of liberal attitude towards the scientific culture of his time. His openness was, however, conditioned by his training, but also motivated by pastoral consideration. In my paper, I looked at two of his writings. which are different in terms of their topic setting and all that, but also very keen given the fact that they follow the same methodological line, particularly the address to youth and the homilies on the excitement on the 6 days of creation. In both cases, Basil pointed out the fact that when a Christian mind looks at cultural products, including the outcomes of whatever scientific endeavor, that Christian mind should apply discernment, should be able to distinguish between what's useful and useless from a Christian perspective, of course, and implement in that very Christian discourse whatever is valid scientifically, culturally, and so on and so forth. This is precisely what you look for, Professor Briggs. And I assume that most of us here, we are here because we seek this kind of wisdom, discernment, and balance. In the address to youth, St. Basil shows how even very young minds, like his Christian students, would be able to fly like a bee, alight on a flower, and take from the flower whatever is useful so that they can produce the honey. Yeah? Similarly, a Christian mind, a more mature mind, in the homilies on the Hexameron, should look at the various scientific theories of the time and select from those theories or that knowledge that is acquired by experiment or otherwise in order to fill the gaps within the Christian narrative, which is something very, very important. You know, we all know about the God of the gaps. Where's God? Well, in the gaps of scientific knowledge. Basil had a very different approach. The gaps were in the theological narrative of the church, and those gaps had to be filled by way of scientific information. That was his approach. Anyway, let me give you an example. So in his homilies on the Hexameron, that's actually, yeah, from the second homily, section 3, we read, when Moses is supposedly the author of Genesis, when Moses said, in the beginning God made the heaven and the earth, he passed over in silence many things, such as water, air, and fire, the elements of pre-cosmology, yeah? Out of which the beings happened to be produced. All these elements, which completed the cosmos, clearly existed, without any doubt, but the story left them out, so that our mind exercised its skills by inferring the rest from little pointers. So Basil looks at Genesis 1, and he sees there a very poetic, symmetrically built narrative of the days of creation, and he knows that, well, it's a matter of fact that we don't live in a vacuum or something. There's air, there's water, there's earth. Where are these things coming from, since Genesis doesn't mention them? Genesis mentions their existence at some point late in the history of the universe, but not their generation. And Basil says, well, we are enticed by the simplicity of the text, which gives you the headlines but not the content of the article. Yeah? We are enticed to dig further and discover those elements. And how do we do that? By making use of the available science. The available science. Of course, for us modern people, that science is outmoded, but nothing prevents us from doing the same today. To look at the available science and fill the gaps in the theological narrative about reality by drawing on the wisdom of knowledge, let's call it that, of contemporary science. The inquisitive mind was supposed to complete the scriptural worldview by referring to the fundamental elements known to ancient physics. That's Basil, of course. It was not Genesis, which supplied the description of the infrastructure of the universe. It was science. In the same vein, Basil filled the gaps in the Genesis account by further descriptions of reality, from the astronomical sky and natural phenomena to plant life and animal behavior, based on personal observations as well as the available sciences. Without pedantically indicating the sources, usually he referred to what the physiology, the researchers of nature, relate. The evidence of scientific information within the Basilian discourse contradicts the hypothesis of a patristic worldview which developed wholly at odds with the cosmology and anthropology of the Greek ancients. I'm quoting from an article written by two Orthodox clergymen. Apart from the theories that contradicted the Christian doctrine of creation, Basil credited the scientific knowledge of his time with a legitimate description of reality. He never objected to the geocentric model or any other tenet of ancient cosmography, including the concentric spheres of the Ptolemaic system, which after all had nothing in common with Scripture and the Christian creed. At the same time, on theological, scripturally supported grounds, Basil rejected the ideological interpretation of natural phenomena from atheistic, pantheistic, and materialistic viewpoints. A relevant example is his treatment of the hypothesis that the universe was self-generated and self-sufficient. Against this view, he affirmed, I quote, "The creation of the sky and the earth must be conveyed not as having happened spontaneously, as some have imagined, but as having their cause from God." So his only point is about keeping in mind that God is there, it's part of the equation. But he had nothing to say in relation to how a certain theory describes the world. He lists a few scientific theories of his time. He pointed out the fact that some of them contradicted each other, that there was no consensus between the theorists of nature in the late ancient world. But he was not interested in contradicting those very theories. He was interested in discussing the ideological bias associated with those theories. At the same time, on theological, scripturally I read this, sorry. On reviewing a range of mutually contradictory physical and cosmological theories, he declined to discuss those theories, which would have required the expertise of a scientist, and reserved for himself the theologian's task to point out that those theories presented a common flaw, an atheistic bias. Incidentally, Basil's worldview was not reducible to a simplistic supernaturalism either, instead referring to a synergetic or interactive structure of nature. More importantly, taken as a starting point the available description of reality, he offered an alternative interpretation to the atheistic one. Specifically, he considered the beings and the phenomena within the created world pointed to a creator and provident God. In so doing, he proved that the established description of reality would support not only atheistic but also theistic interpretations. Now, in the rest of my paper, I discuss a number of examples from the Hexaemeron, and actually in the larger version of the paper, I discussed other church fathers, which shared with St. Basil the same view that there was something significant in the scientific discourse, in the scientific discovery, which should not be overlooked when one tries to make sense of things, to map reality, as it were. But the main thing that Basil and others like him achieved was to draw a line between description and interpretation. You do not expect a scientist, like Professor Andonarakis, for instance, you do not expect a scientist to preach God to you. It's the task of the theologian to look at that description of reality and say, well, I could look at this and say something about God. Or I could paint that established version of reality or representation of reality in the colors of my faith. And that's, for me, already a second to go. That's, to me, the way ahead, which was also followed by a number of venerable representatives of Orthodox theology in modern times.
Thank you.
I finished now.
I can't find out how to stop this. There must be a way to stop it.
I could continue then.
How do I stop it? Does anyone know how to stop this machine?
Can I keep reading?
No, I don't know how to stop this. There we are, we've done it. Okay. I have the advantage over you that I have the full paper, and it is a treat, I have to tell you. So when the full paper becomes available, you look forward to enjoying the whole thing. And I don't know what you think. I think that Basil.
Excuse me, could you please talk to me?
Oh yeah. I think that Basil would have been thrilled not only by the modern scientific discoveries, you know, supplanting the old Greek four elements, but he also would have been thrilled by the discoveries of ancient Near Eastern texts, for example, for temple architecture, which Genesis seems to echo so loudly, where the interest is not in the material that's used, but in the function. What's it for? I think he would have loved that when he read Genesis. We now have a response from Stoyan Tanek, if that is the correct pronunciation. Where is Stoyan? Who is from Carleton University of Ottawa.
Okay, I'll speak from here. So it's already late, so I'll go right away to my comments. First of all, to thank the organizers for having me here and for assigning the paper Father Doru to me. So it's a thought-provoking paper and made me reflect on several things, of which I'll share a couple. Father Doru starts by pointing out that given that in our age the standard representation of reality is the scientific one, to uphold outmoded description of the world as it happens in certain Orthodox milieus is problematic. I can of course join Father Doru in his disappointment with the scientific illiteracy of some Orthodox quarters. He's using the term Orthodox quarters. I interpret the term quarters in broader sense, including both lay people and church leaders. And in this sense, it seems to me that it is a problem, but it's not a problem that's unique to the Orthodox circles only. For example, in a recent talk at my new university at Carleton, given by Lawrence Krauss, a professor of theoretical physics at Arizona State University and self-proclaimed anti-theist, he complained about the scientific illiteracy of Donald Trump's presidential team and the American politicians in general. According to him, some of the most important public debates are missing sound scientific arguments, and it is up to the scientists to fight to regain the relevance of science for public life. I, of course, agree with Krauss on this particular point. There are, however, more layers to this discussion. In my opinion, part of the problem is that contemporary scientists have not done a good job themselves to enable an efficient appropriation of the main achievements of science in the last century. Neither do they offer a single rigorous description of reality that is to be appropriated. For example, quite often popular books on science, as people from the Krauss or others, are not popular at all. They are used by representatives of different streams, research streams, to enjoy arguing between themselves. And here I'm talking about opposition in terms of purely scientific terms. That has nothing to do with theology or religion. So for me, we need to start with the challenge that actually there is no single rigorous representation of reality which we could appropriate as part of our theological work. Is there the relevance of these questions? Is there a single rigorous representation? creates a challenge not only for Orthodox believers, but for anyone interested to learn more about the achievements of contemporary science and eventually incorporate them as part of a worldview. On the other hand, many of the popular books, as Father Dorm mentions, are used as a platform for ungrounded atheistic claims. It's really amazing. Whenever a new book appears by a Nobel Prize winner or so, the majority of them actually, not all of them, but always starts with, whenever they speak about creation, Big Bang, and so on, there is this preliminary statement. I'm not talking about religion here. Let me be clear about this. I've been excited when I was young, but I'm not anymore because I cannot find the experimental evidence or whatever. So my point is that many of those books are really purely atheistic, and I fully agree that we have to deal with this too. Just as a point of, as an example, I would refer to the book by Lawrence Krauss, which is a universe out of nothing that appeared in 2012, and there is a big debate about his view of creation, both for people that are more theologically inclined and by scientists themselves. Well, he might be really devastated that I actually used the book in a theology class because he's a good writer. He's a good writer, and he explained really well what the science is at this moment. And I said to the students, well, read the other negative comments about religion. You will hear them from different places, so you have to reflect on them. So it's not a bad thing to see what Krauss says against religion. Okay, Father Doro emphasizes the distinction between description and interpretation, as well the fact that the scientific description of reality allows for multiple interpretations. According to him, theological interpretations of science relevant to faith-oriented quarters are as legitimate as the atheistic interpretations relevant to other quarters. And I agree fully with that, and would like to bring in another important distinction. He talks about descriptions and interpretations. I believe that we should talk also about appropriation. There might be such theologically well-sounded interpretations, but there is a lot of work for them to be appropriated. Who reads them? What do we do if there are more than one? And actually, here are my main questions, not to Father Doro, but to this kind of audience. What do
please latch on to these questions, because I hope we'll have a short discussion about them before the next talk.
Yeah, so the questions are, what do Orthodox theologians do to help the appropriation of existing theological interpretations of scientific descriptions of reality to their faith-based communities? Are such interpretations available, and are they enough? What if there are more than one theological interpretations? Who is actually responsible and committed to develop them? How well Orthodox theologians have appropriated themselves the latest achievements of contemporary science and integrated them into their theological work? Is our research on the interface of theology and science relevant to our communities? Here I should say that a forum like this is absolutely important. There have been other projects funded by the Templeton Foundation that have been also setting the grounds. But in a way, we preach to the choir, where people that have been preselected to talk about these things. And the question is that, we tend to focus on course upgrades, interesting projects, and so on. But, really we should talk about theology programs, curriculum development, and things that they integrate a kind of perspectives that will help younger theologians to deal with the challenges of the people involved in the churches. And I believe that we don't do enough in this particular direction, and we have to find the ways of doing it. And what we do here is absolutely relevant. The question is that we have to start exploring on a more international basis, creating a virtual project or a committee that needs to start creating content related to particular theological themes that have been important for Eastern Christianity, and develop the resources for seminaries and faculties of theology. So, and I'm not saying that that's easy, Neither I'm trying to undermine the efforts of many scholars in here, who are here at this room. I consider the research on the interface on science and theology as both high caliber scholarship and highly necessary service to the Orthodox Church. My point is that it is our job to enable the adoption of a theological mindset which is eager to engage the sciences in a meaningful way for the benefit of the faithful and the Church in general. How is this to be done? Well, it's also a methodological question. We still need to discuss this too. Just as an example, American Theological Society has the project of Science for Seminaries, which already had a second round, which is for curriculum development, not just one course, but take minimum 2 core courses and integrate science into them in a way to refresh theological curriculum.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, thanks for that marvelous response. Please come and join us here. And when you're ready to speak, please turn on your microphone so that we can hear. So we've had a super presentation by Doru and a stimulating response from Stoyan, in which he raised a number of questions. Does anyone want to tackle one of those questions now? Yes, Chris.
I think what Stoyan was saying was, of course, absolutely right. I think one of the things, though, that we must remember is that in many ways, the Orthodox, perhaps we can't call it a science theology dialogue for all sorts of reasons, but whatever we call it, it is about 50 years behind what's happened in the West. And we do then have the great advantage that we can look at projects, we can look at programs that have been developed in the West over the last 50 years, and particularly perhaps in the last 20 years, and we can see how they can be adapted or adopted for our own use. But in a sense, we're at a much earlier stage. What's happening in the Orthodox world now, to me, is very like what was happening when people like Ian Barber were first writing in the 1960s. So in a sense, we do need to, before we jump onto that and all those programs, we need to go to precisely what our main talk was focusing on, which is how do we develop a theological interpretation of science. This is something which I very much strongly stress, and I would want to very much reinforce what was actually said. The only question I would say is that theological interpretation of science sometimes has to deal with awkward scientific insights. For example, when we were talking about genetics and the genome, the role of chance in the development of the cosmos, in scientific processes generally. This is something which is actually quite difficult to deal with theologically. I don't think it's impossible to do so. But I think as well as simply saying, well, there are multiple interpretations, which is true, we've also got to recognise that if there is to be an authentic theological interpretation, and I would certainly say that I think Orthodoxy has resources here which actually are very important, not just for Orthodox, but for the whole theological world. But if we are going to do that, we've got to face up to the awkward questions and try to really deal with them. So it's not simply a matter of saying, well, here's the theological interpretation. It's actually grappling with some of those awkward questions and recognising that, doing that theological interpretation is not just a matter of saying, oh, well, we Orthodox have a very rich theology of creation, let's apply it to modern science. It's recognising that that very rich theology of creation has to also deal with those very awkward questions which inevitably come up. I'd be interested to hear.
Thank you, Chris, very much. Paul Ewart, Professor of Physics at Oxford, has written a very thoughtful piece on the theological necessity of chance, which he first presented at a dinner discussion in Oxford. Subsequently, it was published in Science and Christian Belief. Let's take 2 more contributions from the floor and then give the panel a chance to respond. So, a couple more contributions if others want to make them. But you'll have to be quick or you'll lose your chance. One more here, yeah.
It's a question addressed to the speaker. Are there some reasons for the contradiction apparent or serious between science and religion, which are built in religion itself and science itself?
That's it. Your chance to respond to that and anything else you want to respond to.
Thank you, Professor Statan. Yeah, well, I don't know about scientists. I'm not one, but I know about the problems that are inbuilt in, well, let's call it generally speaking, religion. And my full paper actually points in that direction. I want to explore the reasons for which theologians do not, Orthodox theologians particularly, do not engage science. When I use the word theologian, I'm not referring only to academics or scholars, teaching in universities, colleges, and that, but also, the wider pool of people that have some theological background, and therefore they feel like they have to say something about everything. And one of the problems in Orthodoxy is the fact that we have a very wrong understanding of our own tradition. This is what my paper is about. We misunderstand our tradition. Look at me wearing the bad weather cloak, and I think that's religion. Yeah? It's a bad weather cloak. We have taken everything the wrong way. We construe ourselves as the bearers of an archive, and we only need to shelve the items where they should be put, but we do not engage this world in a way that is traditional. My example with St. Basil the Great, and I had a few modern theologians which I didn't get to, my examples show that in the past and in the 20th century there has been a range of Orthodox thinkers that have been very committed to the world in which they lived. My point is, in current Orthodoxy, or the contemporary Orthodox world, the main problem is not with we don't have one representation of reality to speak of, and actually I'm not interested personally in the bickering between, I don't know, two quantum physicists about I don't know what phenomenon. Yeah? I'm interested in the fact that there's quantum physics. This is what St. Basil did. There's quantum physics. Yeah? Don't tell me about positons or hadrons and all that. Okay, so we'll get there at some point, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the fact that there's a universe that expands, not the ceiling with light bulbs. So that's what I'm talking about. And the problem is, because in, I don't know what 4th century author, we find that the world is like a ceiling with light bulbs, we can't say anything else. So the problems are inherent to our misunderstanding of tradition.
And it's not only Christians who get it wrong. Lawrence Krauss got it rather badly wrong in his book, because he thinks that a vacuum is nothing. And that's very much a pre-quantum picture of a vacuum, so he's wrong there anyway. Does anyone want to make a last sort of one-sentence contribution to this session?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, Chris, you've had a go already. Anybody else who hasn't already spoken? In that case, why don't you, Stein, just give your last sort of 1 minute's worth, and we'll bring this to a close and move on to the next.
Yes, I would like to go back to the key point of the presentations are based on specific topics. To go back to the point of Father Toro, that he's talking about that we have examples.
1 minute.
Yeah, we have examples in the tradition, and he pointed to St. Basil, and he also pointed to theologians of the 20th century. And there is a way to do it, and we should stop, referring to some, non-existent tradition. Try to use the good examples in the tradition in order to move forward. And I think that is a good message to continue. There are many questions about how this to be done, and so on and so on. But it's a good starting point to look at the best possible examples, of which, for example, Father Dumitru Staniloa is a great one.
So, thank you very much indeed, Doro. Thank you, Stein, for getting us off to a great start with this session. Thank you.